The restaurant was one of those places with white tablecloths and soft lighting that makes everyone look slightly more polished than they are. My fiancé's parents had insisted on hosting the engagement dinner there, calling it appropriate for the occasion. My father arrived 10 minutes early wearing his pressed navy uniform shirt and the same worn leather jacket he's had for years. He looked slightly out of place among the tailored suits and silk dresses, but he stood straight steady as ever. When my future mother-in-law introduced him to the table, she smiled tightly. "And this is her father," she said. Then after a brief pause that didn't feel accidental, she added, "He's just a delivery driver." Just. A few people chuckled politely. My future sister-in-law covered her mouth to hide a grin. My fiancé shifted in his seat but didn't correct her. My father nodded, calm, unbothered. "That's right," he said simply. "I run deliveries. Run deliveries." The words carried weight I knew they didn't hear. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I didn't speak. I watched my father take his seat, place his cap neatly beside his plate, and fold his hands as if nothing had happened. The conversation moved on quickly: wine pairings, stock portfolios, and vacation homes. But the laughter lingered. What they didn't know was that he wasn't there just as my dad. My father has never needed a title to know who he is. When I was 7, I used to wait by the front window for his delivery truck to turn the corner. He would park carefully, climb down slowly, and always wave before unlocking the front door. Some nights he smelled like diesel and cardboard, other nights like rain and long hours. But he always walked upright. He never complained about work. Not once. "Every job deserves to be done well," he would say when I asked why he left before sunrise. "That's the only part you control." He worked weekends when the routes were heavier. He volunteered for extra shifts during holidays so other drivers with younger children could stay home. When I got older and realized how tired he must have been, I asked him why he didn't look for something better. He smiled. "Better isn't louder," he said. "Better is steady." Steady. That word shaped my childhood more than any lecture about ambition. He taught me how to check oil in the car, how to shake someone's hand properly, and how to show up even when no one notices. When people made jokes about blue-collar work, he never corrected them. He simply continued doing his job well. "Never argue with ignorance," he once told me after a neighbor made a remark about people like us. "Let results speak." He never raised his voice to demand respect. He built it quietly. At that dinner, while my in-laws discussed mergers and market shares, I watched my father listen more than he spoke. He asked questions that were thoughtful and precise. He paid attention. There was dignity in the way he folded his napkin. There was confidence in the way he held eye contact. The difference between him and my in-laws wasn't education. It was arrogance. They measured worth in titles. He measured it in consistency. And consistency, I've learned, has a way of outlasting noise. That dinner wasn't the first time I felt the difference between our families. It had always been there, tucked beneath polite smiles and careful compliments. The first time I brought my father to meet them, my future mother-in-law asked which division he worked in. When he explained that he handled regional deliveries, she nodded slowly, as if translating the answer into something socially acceptable. "Oh," she said. "Hansen. Hansen." It was delivered like praise, but it felt like classification. My future father-in-law once asked if my dad had ever considered moving into management, as if physical labor were a stepping stone rather than a choice. When my father replied that he preferred staying operational, the subject shifted quickly to property investments. At holidays, the comparisons were subtler. Conversations about ski trips and private school tuition. Comments about long-term planning and building generational wealth. The kind of language that sounds inclusive but quietly establishes hierarchy. My father listened politely. I noticed the way they never asked him about strategy, even when he referenced logistics systems or distribution efficiency. They assumed simplicity where there was none. Even with me, the tone carried weight. "You must be so proud of what our son has achieved," my mother-in-law would say, emphasizing our, as if my family were spectators to their success story. When I spoke about my own work, the responses were measured. "That's interesting. Flexible careers can be risky. Stability matters." Stability. The irony was almost constant. The contempt was never loud enough to confront directly. It hid behind etiquette, behind carefully phrased questions that positioned us slightly below without appearing cruel. It accumulated quietly. And by the time they laughed at just a delivery driver, the foundation for that moment had already been built. The comment might have passed unnoticed if it had ended with the introduction. But it didn't. As the wine was poured and appetizers were served, my future father leaned back in his chair and asked my dad about his routes. "Must be a lot of driving," he said almost conversationally. "There is," my dad replied. "Keeps the supply chain moving." My future mother-in-law laughed lightly. "Well," she said, lifting her glass, "someone has to." The table reacted instantly. A ripple of polite laughter. A few knowing nods. Even my fiancé smiled, though he tried to mask it quickly. Someone has to. The phrase landed like a dismissal wrapped in humor. I felt it in my chest before I processed it in my mind. That tightening. That familiar heat that rises when something is wrong, but socially protected by laughter. My father didn't flinch. He nodded once, slow and steady. "Yes," he said calmly. "Someone does." He didn't correct her tone. He didn't explain. He didn't defend. He simply returned to his plate as if the comment had no weight. But it did. Because the laughter didn't stop immediately. It lingered. It reinforced. My sister-in-law added, "I can't imagine waking up that early every day." My father smiled politely. "You get used to it." Used to it. I wanted to speak. To point out that the trucks he supervised delivered products their businesses relied on. That without someone like him their investments would sit in warehouses untouched. But I stayed quiet. Not because I was ashamed. Because I was watching. The line had been crossed not through shouting but through assumption. They believed they had accurately placed him. They believed they understood the hierarchy in the room. And my father let them. For now. At some point between the main course and dessert, my father reached up and removed his cap. He didn't do it abruptly. Just a quiet motion, as if the room had grown warmer. He placed it neatly beside his plate, smoothing the brim with his thumb before folding his hands again. I had seen that gesture thousands of times. But that night something about it held my attention. The cap wasn't new. The navy fabric had faded slightly from years of wear. The stitching along the edge was reinforced where it had begun to loosen. To anyone else at the table, it was proof of the narrative they had already decided was true. Uniform. Driver. Blue collar. But when he turned it slightly to adjust its position, the logo caught the light. It wasn't the generic patch most drivers wore. It was embroidered differently, subtler, more refined. The name wasn't the standard distribution label printed on delivery trucks across the city. It was the corporate parent company. The holding firm. The one currently in talks with several mid-sized businesses in the region. Including my future father-in-law's company. My heart didn't race. It steadied. I had seen that logo before, not on a truck but in acquisition briefs and industry reports. It wasn't flashy. It didn't advertise itself. But it controlled far more infrastructure than most people realized. My father's hand rested lightly on the table, and his posture relaxed. He asked my fiancé's father a thoughtful question about inventory turnaround rates, something precise enough that it shifted the tone of the conversation momentarily. They answered casually. They had no idea. To them the cap was confirmation of status. To me it was context. My father wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. He did run deliveries. But he also did something else. Something they hadn't bothered to ask about. I watched him sit there steady, composed, allowing their assumptions to settle. Hidden power doesn't announce itself. It waits. And that cap on the table wasn't a symbol of limitation. It was a quiet introduction they had completely misunderstood. As dessert arrived, the conversation shifted toward business. My future father-in-law leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly in the way people do when they want to signal importance without appearing boastful. "We're finalizing a major logistics contract," he said. "It'll double our distribution capacity by next quarter." My fiancé nodded with pride evident. "It's a big move. A necessary one," his mother added. "Expansion like this doesn't come often." They began discussing timelines and regional access, supply routes. Numbers floated casually across the table: projections, margins, efficiency gains. The tone carried certainty. "It's with a regional firm that's been consolidating quietly," my father-in-law continued. "They've been acquiring smaller operators for years." I didn't interrupt. My father didn't either. But I noticed the smallest shift in his posture, not tension, not surprise. Recognition. That firm controls a significant portion of last-mile infrastructure now, my fiancé said confidently. Getting their approval is the key. Approval. The word hung in the air. My father lifted his glass, taking a slow sip. Due diligence must be thorough, he said calmly. My future father-in-law waved a hand dismissively. It's procedural. We've been assured it's practically done. Practically. They spoke about the contract as if it were inevitable. As if the handshake had already occurred and the paperwork were a formality. They did not know that regulatory clearance and partnership approval required more than optimism. They did not know who had access to that process. They did not know the logo embroidered quietly on the cap resting beside my father's plate was directly tied to the firm evaluating their expansion. The irony was precise. They had laughed at just a delivery driver. Now they were celebrating a contract dependent on the company he helped build. The collision was coming, and they were the only ones unaware of it. The sound of the restaurant door opening barely registered at first. It was just another arrival. Another table being seated. But then I saw him. Tall. Tailored suit. Polished shoes that reflected the soft lighting. He paused briefly near the entrance, scanning the room with quiet confidence before his gaze landed directly on our table. On my father. His expression changed instantly. Richard. He called out warmly, walking toward us without hesitation. Every conversation at our table stopped. My future father-in-law glanced up, mildly annoyed at the interruption. My fiancé followed his gaze. The man approached and extended his hand, not to my fiancé, not to his father, to mine. Didn't expect to see you here, he said with an easy familiarity. My father stood smoothly, returning the handshake. Small world, he replied. The tone of their exchange was not casual acquaintance. It was equal footing. Professional recognition. The man's eyes briefly scanned the table, assessing faces. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said politely. We've got confirmation. Confirmation. My future father-in-law straightened slightly. I'm sorry, he said, confused. And you are? The man smiled politely but didn't answer immediately. His attention remained on my father. The air shifted. Not dramatically. Structurally. Whatever dynamic had existed at the table moments earlier dissolved quietly. Because the way that man addressed my father wasn't consistent with someone speaking to just a delivery driver. It was the way partners speak. And everyone felt it. The man reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim leather folder. He didn't open it right away. He simply held it between his fingers, looking at my father with the kind of restrained satisfaction that belongs to people who have waited for something difficult to clear. Then he said the three words that changed the room. We're approved, Richard. The sentence was quiet. Not theatrical. Not loud enough for nearby tables to turn. But at ours it landed with absolute force. My father nodded once, as if receiving news he had expected but still respected. Good, he said. Then we move carefully. Move carefully. My future father-in-law's face changed. The confidence from minutes earlier thinned into alertness. He glanced from the folder to my father, then back to the man in the suit. Approved for what? He asked. The man finally turned toward him. A regional integration package. My fiancé's hand tightened around his glass. My mother-in-law blinked, still trying to place the conversation within the version of my father she understood. Aren't you? She began, then stopped. Just a delivery driver. She didn't say it this time. The words were already in the room. My father remained calm. Almost still. I watched the confusion ripple across the table as pieces began aligning in their minds, slowly and reluctantly. The logo on the cap. The contract they had been bragging about. The man with the folder. The approval. My father didn't explain immediately. He let the silence do what he had always taught me results could do. Speak. The man in the tailored suit finally placed the leather folder on the table. For context, he said, glancing politely at my future father-in-law, Richard and I founded the regional logistics network 15 years ago. The words were delivered evenly without flourish. Founded. My father didn't interrupt him. We started small, the man continued. Independent routes. Then acquisitions. Consolidations. Infrastructure investment. My future father-in-law's expression shifted from confusion to calculation. You're with. He began naming the holding company under his breath. My father nodded. I still run deliveries, he said calmly. It keeps me connected to the operation. There was no defensiveness in his tone. No need to correct the earlier laughter. I believe in understanding the ground level, he added. You can't lead supply chains from behind a desk alone. The room was silent now, not out of politeness but recalibration. My fiancé looked between his father and mine. You never mentioned, he started. You never asked, my father replied gently. The man in the suit opened the folder, sliding a single document across the table toward my future father-in-law. Your expansion proposal has been cleared, he said. Pending final integration review. Integration review. The same contract they had discussed minutes earlier with such certainty. You're overseeing that? My future father-in-law asked, voice noticeably steadier than his posture. My team is, my father said. I stay involved. Involved. Not just a delivery driver. The hierarchy inverted quietly. The man they had introduced with a qualifier was now the structural authority behind the contract their company depended on. My mother-in-law's smile had disappeared entirely. I had no idea, she said. That's understandable, my father answered. Titles don't always tell the full story. He picked up his cap from the table, brushing his thumb across the embroidered logo. I never hid what I do, he continued. I just don't feel the need to lead with it. The statement wasn't accusatory. It was factual. My future father-in-law cleared his throat. Well, this is impressive. My father offered a small nod. It's steady work, he said. Steady. The word carried more weight now than any executive title mentioned earlier in the evening. No one laughed. No one was dismissed. Because the man they had minimized was the one holding the framework beneath their ambition. And he hadn't raised his voice once. No one touched their dessert. The room, which had buzzed with casual superiority minutes earlier, now felt narrower. Conversations at nearby tables continued, unaware that the balance at ours had shifted entirely. My future father-in-law adjusted his jacket as if straightening fabric might restore composure. I wasn't aware of your broader role, he said carefully. Most people aren't, my father replied. My mother-in-law attempted a smile that didn't quite settle. Well, she began, voice overly bright. We had no idea you were involved at that level. That's wonderful. Wonderful. The same mouth that had said, just a delivery driver, now searched for dignified footing. My father didn't correct her phrasing. He didn't reference the earlier remark. He simply inclined his head politely. It's all part of the same work, he said. A few of the guests who had laughed earlier avoided eye contact entirely. One man quietly cleared his throat and complimented the wine as if the subject had never existed. The embarrassment didn't explode. It tightened. The hierarchy had not been loudly overturned. It had been quietly corrected. My fiancé looked at me, something unspoken in his expression, recognition perhaps. Or realization. The dynamic at the table recalibrated without confrontation. No apologies were demanded. No speeches delivered. But the laughter was gone. And in its place was something heavier. Respect. After dinner, my future father-in-law asked my dad if they could speak privately. They stepped toward the edge of the restaurant terrace, away from the table but still within sight. I didn't strain to hear them. I watched body language instead. My future father-in-law stood slightly forward, shoulders squared but cautious. The confident ease he carried earlier had shifted into something more measured. I hope there was no offense meant, I heard him say faintly. My father's posture remained steady. Not defensive. Not triumphant. None taken, he replied. It wasn't dismissive. It was controlled. We value professionalism, my future father-in-law continued. Especially when partnerships are involved. So do I, my dad said evenly. There was a pause. I assume the integration review will proceed as planned, he added carefully. It will proceed as it should, my father answered. Standards don't change because of dinner conversations. The sentence was calm, direct, final. No accusation. No retaliation. Just a boundary. They shook hands before returning to the table. When they sat down again, something fundamental had settled into place. The apology hadn't been theatrical. The correction hadn't been loud. But authority had been established. Not through humiliation. Through professionalism. And professionalism carries weight that social hierarchy cannot override. On the drive home, my father didn't mention the laughter. He didn't replay the moment or dissect their expressions. He simply drove steady, hands on the wheel, eyes focused on the road. After a few miles, he glanced at me briefly. "You handled that well," he said. "I didn't do anything," I replied. "You didn't need to." That was his way of explaining the entire evening. He had never chased recognition, never corrected people for underestimating him. He allowed assumptions to exist until they collided with reality on their own. "Never argue with ignorance," he reminded me quietly. "Let results speak." The phrase settled differently now. At dinner, they had measured him by his uniform. They had mistaken simplicity for limitation. They had confused visibility with value. But titles don't create authority. Work does. Consistency does. Integrity does. Respect, I've learned, it isn't granted by social position. It's revealed under pressure. They had introduced him as just a delivery driver. He left as the structural authority behind their expansion. And he didn't raise his voice once. That was the real lesson. You don't explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You build something undeniable. And when the moment arrives, you let results speak.